Welcome. Ready for another journey into the unknown? I'd love to know where you're watching from. Now put on your headphones, turn off the lights, and try not to let fear take hold of you. Protecting people had always been my childhood dream, and that's what led me to wear the uniform. It was more than just a career choice. It was a calling that echoed deep within my soul. A voice that whispered I was meant to stand between the innocent and the darkness that sometimes consumes this world. Every day since I was a little girl, I imagined myself as that guardian, that protector who could make someone feel safe when everything around them was falling apart. My graduation was one of the most special days of my life, a moment suspended in time that still glows warm in my memory. My entire family was there, their faces beaming with pride, applauding and shouting my name when I received my badge. The weight of that medal against my chest felt like destiny finally clicking into place. I was eager to start working, filled with this burning desire to make a difference, to prove that one person could change lives, could save lives. But I had no idea, no possible way of knowing, that my first serious call would leave scars that would never fade, marks on my soul that no amount of time could ever fully heal. It was around 3 in the afternoon on a cloudy autumn day when the radio in the patrol car crackled to life. My partner and I were doing routine patrol, driving through familiar streets that suddenly felt different, heavier somehow. The air was freezing, and that fine drizzle was falling, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes the whole city feel wrapped in this oppressive, melancholy blanket. The world seemed muted, like it was holding its breath for something terrible about to unfold. The call came from a neighborhood on the outskirts, on the other side of the city, far from the comfortable streets we'd been patrolling. It took us about 20 minutes to get there, 20 minutes where my mind raced through possibilities, preparing myself for what we might encounter. As soon as I heard the address crackle through the radio, I already knew it was going to be complicated. That sinking feeling settling in my stomach like a stone. That area was known for being rough, with a high incidence of domestic violence calls, situations where emotions ran hot and dangerous. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what we were about to find waiting behind that door. When we arrived at the location, I saw a small, very old house, and immediately felt something strange, something wrong in the air. The front door was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the cold breeze, and there was nobody on the street, no witnesses, no neighbors peeking through curtains. The silence was unnatural, threatening. Cover the perimeter in the back while I approach from the front, I told my partner, my voice steadier than I felt inside. He agreed with a quick nod and ran toward the side of the house, his footsteps fading into the drizzle. I waited until he was in position before approaching the entrance, following protocol but feeling that cold knot tightening in my stomach with each step. My hand moved instinctively to my holster, ready to draw my weapon if needed. I tried to remember everything I'd learned at the academy, all those scenarios we'd practiced. But this tease was real, and real never feels like training. The silence was total, absolute, broken only by the sound of my footsteps on the wet ground of the entrance, each step echoing louder than it should. As soon as I entered, the first thing I saw was the chaos, the violence that had erupted in this small space. The furniture was all overturned, cheers, broken pictures shattered on the floor. You could see that an ugly fight had taken place here, something brutal and desperate. But what froze me in place, what made my blood run cold, was the trail of blood on the floor, dark and still wet, glistening under the dim light. I followed the stains down the hallway until I reached a bedroom in the back. The door was closed, but I could hear muffled sobs coming from inside, the sound of someone's world completely shattered. I opened the door slowly, my training taking over even as my heart hammered against my ribs, and the scene I witnessed froze my blood in my veins. In the middle of the room, there was a man sprawled on the floor, covered in blood, so much blood that it pooled beneath him like a dark lake. I approached carefully and checked his pulse, already knowing what I'd find. He was dead, his skin already cooling under my fingertips. Near him, huddled in a corner like a wounded animal, was a woman holding a knife, her whole body trembling without stopping, shaking so violently I thought she might collapse. She was covered in bruises and cuts, marks of violence painted across her skin, and the look in her eyes was one of terror I had never seen before, a fear so profound it seemed to have hollowed her out from the inside. In that moment, I understood what had happened. She had killed him. The story was written in blood and bruises, and the overturned furniture in her traumatized eyes. Have you ever felt that moment when you realize the world is as simple as you thought it was? When the line between victim and perpetrator blurs into something you can't quite define? When justice and survival become the same desperate act, ... I approached carefully, raising my hands to show her I was there to help, not to harm. Calm down, man. I'm with the police. Everything's okay now. You're safe. I spoke softly, gently, trying not to frighten her even more, knowing that one wrong word could shatter whatever fragile thread was holding her together. Slowly, very slowly, I managed to get her to release the knife, her fingers uncurling one by one from the handle. I helped her stand and supported her to the living room sofa, feeling how light she was, how hollowed out by trauma. She collapsed and went into complete shock, her eyes staring at nothing. Her body there, but her mind somewhere far away, somewhere safer. My partner entered shortly after through the back and secured the location while I called for backup and forensics over the radio, my voice mechanical, professional, even as my insides churned. While we waited for the arrival of the civil police and the paramedics, I observed the house more carefully, and what I saw was deeply disturbing details that painted a picture of horror that had been building for far longer than just today. Sharing the comments and affirmation beginning with, "I recognize that, ... Sometimes naming our truth is the first step toward healing. And your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today, to know they're not alone. When we speak our reality aloud, we claim our power back from the silence that keeps us trapped. And we create a community of witnesses who understand that strength sometimes looks like survival, not perfection. There were chains and ropes scattered throughout the rooms, things used to keep someone imprisoned, to strip away every shred of freedom and dignity. There was old food residue everywhere, garbage spread across surfaces, the stench of neglect and cruelty permeating every corner. It became painfully clear that something far worse than we'd imagined had happened here. That this was not just a moment of violence, but a sustained campaign of torture that had unfolded over time, hidden behind closed doors, while the world outside went on oblivious. The woman's name was Janena. She was taken to the hospital under escort to treat her injuries. Her body a map of suffering that told a story words could never fully capture. In the following days, as the investigation unfolded, the truth emerged like something crawling out from under a rock, ugly and undeniable. The investigation revealed that Janena had been trapped in that house for more than 3 years, suffering absurd, unimaginable violence at the hands of that man who now lay dead on the floor. The medical report showed the scars covering her body, layers upon layers of healed wounds that spoke of repeated attacks. And the condition of that house was proof of the hell she had lived through, evidence that couldn't be denied or explained away. Janena's story affected me deeply. Reaching past my professional training into the vulnerable parts of myself I usually kept locked away. Even after handing the case over to the investigation team, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Couldn't shake the images from my mind. How did she endure for so long? What went through her head when she finally decided to fight back? When survival instinct finally overpowered fear? I knew that by law she would have to answer for the homicide, that the system required accountability regardless of circumstances. But I also knew this wasn't an ordinary crime. This was an extreme situation of survival, a woman pushed so far beyond what any human should endure that the normal rules felt almost obscene to apply. During the trial process, I did what I could to help, knowing my voice might make a difference. I was called to testify in court as the officer who responded to the scene, and I described in detail the horrible conditions of the house and the state of shock in which I'd found her mind fractured by trauma, her body trembling with the aftershocks of years of terror. The jury understood the context, the nightmare she'd been living, but still concluded there had been excess in self-defense, that somewhere in that desperate act she'd crossed a legal line. Even so, thanks to the mitigating circumstances, her sentence was significantly reduced. A small mercy in a situation that had none. Instead of facing decades behind bars, she was sentenced to just a few years in a closed regime. Time that felt both too much and somehow inevitable, given how the law works. At first, Janena was terrified at the idea of going to prison. The thought of being locked up again, triggering memories she'd barely survived. But I assured her she wouldn't be alone, that I wouldn't forget her or abandon her to the system. I continued visiting her whenever I could, always outside of work hours and respecting all protocols, checking to see if she was receiving psychological counseling, if anyone was helping her process the impossible weight she carried. And each time I saw her, I was surprised by her strength, by the resilience that somehow survived everything that had tried to destroy it. Even after everything, she kept fighting to reclaim her life, to become more than just what had been done to her. 2.5 years later, Janina earned conditional freedom for good behavior. A second chance she'd fought for with every fiber of her being. I saw her leaving the prison and reuniting with her family, people she hadn't seen in years. Faces that represented the life she thought she'd lost forever. It was emotional, overwhelming, and it reminded me exactly why I chose to wear this uniform. Why I endure the darkness to help people find their way back to the light. What would it mean to you to know that sometimes the bravest thing someone can do is simply survive one more day? That fighting back after years of silent suffering isn't weakness, but the purest form of strength. I couldn't change the law, couldn't rewrite the rules that governed what happened next, but I understood her desperation in a way that transcended legal codes and procedures. That man was a monster, and honestly, he's not even worth wasting words describing. Not worth giving him any more space in this story than he deserves. Leave in the comments your reflection beginning with, I commit to double quotes, because when we declare our intentions aloud, we transform thought into action, and your commitment might inspire someone else to take that first difficult step they've been afraid to take. Our promises to ourselves and others create ripples that extend far beyond what we can see, building a world where more people choose courage over silence, compassion over judgment. This call taught me that justice doesn't always come in black and white, that the world refuses to fit into neat categories. Sometimes it appears in shades of gray, in those uncomfortable spaces where we need to balance the law with compassion, where we must recognize that being human means understanding the impossible choices people face when pushed beyond their limits. The image of that destroyed house and Janina's frightened eyes was burned into my memory forever, etched so deeply I see it when I close my eyes. I can't erase it, and maybe I shouldn't even try. It's this memory that reminds me why I put on this uniform every day, why I walk into darkness knowing what I might find there. Not every battle has a happy ending. Not every story resolves the way we wish it would. But each person we manage to pull out of hell already justifies everything else. Every sleepless night, every traumatic scene, every moment of doubt. I've worked as a police officer for years now, and I've seen many things I would have preferred never to witness. Images that haunt the quiet moments, but when it involves a child, everything changes completely, shifts into a different gear entirely. It hits a different place, you know. It awakens a protective instinct that sometimes takes me beyond what I should do, beyond the boundaries of professional distance. Lucas's case was exactly one of those moments. One of those situations that gets under your skin and stays there. It was a hot summer afternoon when that case was finally officially assigned to me, landing on my desk like a weight I knew I'd carry whether I solved it or not. Lucas had been missing for more than 4 weeks, and all the initial investigation had turned up nothing. Just dead ends and cold trails. That morning, before officially taking the case, I had already talked to his mother on the phone, and the anguish in her voice was palpable, tangible, even through the crackling connection. It was a mixture of desperation and this tiny sliver of hope that made me feel a chill run down my spine, a pressure that settled on my chest and didn't leave. From the beginning, I knew the situation was different, that this wasn't going to be straightforward. The first pieces of information in the investigation were confusing, everything fragmented and contradictory. Some neighbors mentioned seeing a group of strange men with unfriendly faces lurking around the neighborhood days before the boy disappeared. Shadows that didn't belong. Others talked about a suspicious car, an old model that had been parked near the family's house for hours, just sitting there like it was waiting for something. I knew time was working against us, that every hour that passed was another hour Lucas spent in danger. Each hour that ticked by decreased the chances of finding him alive, a fact that haunted every decision I made. The investigation was heavy, exhausting, both for the body and the mind, pushing us to our limits and then beyond. For almost 2 intense weeks, day and night bleeding into each other until I lost track, my team and I chased after any sign, any whisper of information. We interviewed witnesses until our voices were hoarse, and checked every corner that could lead to the boy, every location that might hold answers. The city became a labyrinth where each wrong step could cost him his life. where one missed clue could mean the difference between rescue and tragedy. Every vacant lot, every abandoned construction site, every plaza became a suspicious place, somewhere that might be hiding him. The faces of his parents, with deep dark circles under their eyes, and filled with pain that aged them years and weeks, never left my mind, appearing in my dreams and my waking thoughts alike. I remember exactly the moment when the key turned, when everything shifted. After knocking on dozens of doors and pressuring contacts on the street, relentlessly pursuing every lead, no matter how thin, an informant finally came forward. He asked not to be identified for fear of retaliation, his voice shaking as he passed along the location of an abandoned house on the outskirts, in a very remote, brushy area where no one would think to look. As we headed there in an unmarked vehicle, my heart felt like it was going to leap out of my mouth, pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. It was a mixture of adrenaline and fear of what we were going to see, what condition we'd find him in if we found him at all. Was he still alive? My head wouldn't stop for a second, racing through scenarios, preparing myself for the worst while hoping desperately for the best. When we raided the location, approaching with tactical precision, the atmosphere was heavy, oppressive, like the air itself was warning us. The house was falling apart, walls black with mold and the floor creaking with each step, as if the place had its own life and was telling bad stories, whispering secrets of the horrors it had witnessed. The smell of dampness, mixed with rotting garbage, took over the entire house, filling our lungs with every breath. It was unbearable, nauseating, the kind of smell that clings to you long after you leave. Every dark corner seemed to hide something sinister, something waiting to reveal itself. The tension inside that place was suffocating, pressing down on us like a physical weight that made breathing difficult. It was in a back room, locked with a padlock that spoke of deliberate imprisonment, that we found Lucas. The boy was tied to an old chair, far too pale and frozen with fear, his small body rigid with trauma. His wide eyes seemed to carry the weight of everything he'd endured during those weeks of captivity. Stories of horror written in his thousand-yard stare that no child should ever have. 3 men were guarding the location, criminals of the worst kind, the type who'd long ago abandoned any shred of humanity they might have once possessed. The cold way they looked at us made me sick to my stomach, their eyes empty of remorse or fear, just calculating their next move. The situation became critical in a snap of fingers, everything shifting from tense standoff to active crises. One of them, armed and seeing there was no way out, tried to grab the boy as a shield, his rough hands reaching for that fragile body. It wasn't a movie scene with choreographed moves and dramatic music. It was fast, messy, chaotic, the kind of violence that happens in heartbeats. I took advantage of a moment of his hesitation, that split second where he was deciding his next move, and I went for him. I managed to grab his arm and lock the weapon, forcing the barrel away from Lucas, while my colleagues helped immobilize the guy before he could do something even worse. Before desperation made him pull that trigger. As soon as the situation was controlled, as soon as I knew the immediate danger had passed, I hugged Lucas tightly, feeling his little body trembling non-stop against my chest, shaking like he might never stop. The worst had passed. The physical danger was over. But I knew the trauma would remain, would follow him through nightmares and triggered memories for years to come. While backup didn't arrive to take the prisoners away, while we waited in that horrible place, I tried to calm the boy down, to bring him back from wherever his mind had fled to survive. I told him it was over, that he was safe now, that no one would hurt him again. He sobbed in a way that hurt my soul to hear, these deep, wrenching sounds that seemed to come from somewhere beyond childhood, beyond innocence. I felt a rage burning inside me, an almost uncontrollable urge to deliver justice right there against those guys, to make them feel a fraction of the fear they'd inflicted on this child. I took a deep breath and clenched my fists until my nails dug into my palms. I knew I had to keep my head in the right place, had to be the professional this situation required, even when every fiber of my being wanted to be something else. The investigation afterward revealed something nobody expected, a betrayal that made the whole thing even more sickening. Lucas's uncle, a guy who frequented the house and whom the family trusted with closed eyes, with complete faith, had facilitated everything and handed his nephew over to those criminals like he was a package, like family meant nothing. The motivations were never totally clear, not even during the trial process, leaving questions that gnawed at everyone involved. Some investigators thought it was drug debt or extortion. pressure from people even worse than the kidnappers. Others suspected darker things, twisted reasons that made even hardened cops uncomfortable. But the uncle never confessed the real reason. Took that secret with him into his cell. What matters is that he was arrested and justice will collect from him, make him pay in the currency of years behind bars. Thinking about this case always leaves me torn between rage and sadness, two emotions that pull at me simultaneously. Rage at the dirty betrayal, at the violation of the most sacred bond, and sadness for what Lucas went through, for the innocence that was stolen from him. We managed to save his life, yes, and that matters. That's everything. But his innocence stayed in that house, left behind in that locked room with the moldy walls and the smell of despair. Haven't you ever wondered why some wounds heal while others stay open, bleeding quietly beneath the surface where no one can see? Why saving someone's life sometimes feels both like everything and not nearly enough. The marks from that day will never completely disappear, will never fade to nothing, no matter how much time passes. Every time I look at my own children, their faces innocent and trusting, I remember Lucas and so many other children we still need to find, still need to rescue from situations we can barely imagine. This case rubbed in my face how fragile innocence really is, how easily it can be shattered, and how there are bad people in this world. People who should protect and end up being the executioners, the destroyers of the very lives they should cherish. Lucas's uncle is in jail, where he should stay, where he belongs. But trying to understand how someone of the same blood does this is a mystery that haunts me to this day. That keeps me awake, wondering about the darkness that can live inside people who seem normal. The following weeks were a mixture of relief and pain happening simultaneously. Emotions that shouldn't coexist, but somehow did. Relief that Lucas was alive, that we'd gotten there in time. But pain watching the family deal with the pieces, trying to put together something that would never quite fit the same way again. He started counseling with psychologists, beginning the long process of healing. But I know wounds like this take years to close, if they ever truly do. The community embraced the family. Everyone helped however they could with meals and money and presents. But that heavy atmosphere took a long time to pass. The porch conversations, the worried looks, that feeling that it could happen to anyone, to any family. All of that became the scar that crime left on our neighborhood. A mark that changed how people saw the world around them. Write in the comments a declaration beginning with, "I accept that ... because acknowledging our truth, even when it's painful, especially when it's painful, frees us from the weight of pretending everything is fine. Your honesty might give someone else permission to stop carrying their burden alone. To admit that being strong doesn't mean never breaking, and that acceptance is often where real healing finally begins." This case stuck to me in a way no other managed to, burrowing under my skin and making a home there. There are nights I wake up sweating with the image of Lucas tied to that chair burning in my head, playing on repeat like a horror film I can't turn off. But you know what keeps me standing? What gets me out of bed the next morning? It's knowing he's alive, that we managed to pull him out of that hell before it consumed him completely. The uncle will pay for what he did. Justice is running its course through the courts, but the damage has already been done, and that hurts. That knowledge that we can't undo what happened. I continue working, doing what I can to protect those who can't defend themselves alone. Because at the end of the day, each life saved is worth all the sleepless nights, all the trauma we carry. Lucas will carry these scars for the rest of his life. They'll be part of who he becomes, but at least he has a life to live, and that, however small it may seem, makes all the difference in the world. I was a civil police agent and worked supervising inmates in semi-open and conditional regimes for more than 9 years of my life. And truthfully, it has nothing to do with what they show in action movies, with car chases and dramatic shootouts and heroic speeches. It was supposed to be just a quiet job until my retirement. Something stable and predictable where I could coast to the finish line. But it was precisely my attempt to do something more, to go beyond the minimum, that transformed a routine visit into the worst nightmare of my life, into something that would define my final years on the force. I stayed in that role for exactly 9 years, 4 months, and 18 days. I can still count them, still remember the weight of each one. It was nothing like the time I worked as a guard in the old prison system back when I was younger and stronger, but after a serious car accident at the end of '97 that left me broken in ways that never fully healed. This was one of the few options left for me that weren't disability retirement. Many colleagues told me to accept retirement, to take the state check, and buy that boat I'd always talked about. To start that fishing and tourism service that had been my dream for so many years. My plan for a life beyond the uniform, but honestly, sincerely. That felt like I was surrendering, throwing in the towel and admitting defeat. Besides, there was the fact that if I worked 9 more years, I'd have the right to a full pension and all my medical treatments covered. Security that mattered more as my body reminded me daily of its limitations. And it was this last point that ended up being the deciding factor. The thing that tipped the scales towards staying. So instead of going to enjoy life at the beach with a fat check and a messed up leg, instead of choosing comfort, I continued in the criminal enforcement department, limping through hallways and filling out forms. I worked with hundreds, possibly thousands of cases before my eventual retirement. An endless parade of names and faces and stories. And sadly, I believe I only had a handful of stories that could interest anyone that rose above the mundane routine. Supervising people on conditional release wasn't exactly full of action. Wasn't the stuff of legend or campfire tales. And it's always funny when movies show us as those tough cops who kick down doors and chase criminals through alleys, when in reality most of us are already tired, slow, and full of joint pain. Our bodies worn down by years of service, with some exceptions, obviously. I think I only had 3 or 4 serious incidents in my entire career in that role. Moments when everything went wrong despite the routine nature of the work. But the situations I experienced were so intense, if not more so than anything I went through inside prison walls, including the time I almost lost my life in a situation involving a man who in another life could have been a cousin or a nephew, someone who might have sat at my dinner table instead of across from me in that terrible moment. Mine, maybe even a son. I met Sandro for the first time in an area of distant farms, almost in the rural zone, a place he called his temporary home after leaving the state penitentiary. That collection of properties was part of a resocialization project we were managing, somewhat improvised due to lack of funding, doing the best we could with limited resources. And all that extra freedom meant only the most promising rehabilitated inmates could stay there, the ones we believed had the best chance of making it on the outside. And of all those guys who ended up living in that brush for a while trying to rebuild their lives from scratch, I would have sworn Sandro was the most solid of them all, the one most likely to succeed. He was a former military police officer from Bope, a real skull operator, with a heavy history of operations in the favelas. Before things really went sideways for him, but even being trained for war, for the kind of violence most people can't imagine. His head couldn't handle the constant pressure of confrontations in Rio. The relentless cycle of violence and death. I remember he used to say he left the force with a serious condition he called the tremors, a name that somehow captured what medications and diagnoses couldn't. I suppose officially what Sandro suffered from would be categorized as some form of post-traumatic stress disorder, the kind that comes from seeing too much, from doing things that haunt you. But for some reason, he never called it that, never used the clinical terms. He just said he had tremors sometimes when his mind thought too much about the things he'd seen in the slums. Images that played on repeat in the quiet moments. He tried every kind of medication, the strongest prescriptions they could give him, every kind of therapy, from talk to exposure to everything in between. But nothing worked. Nothing could quiet the shaking that came from somewhere deeper than his muscles. Then one day, in an act of pure desperation to destroy himself once and for all, or maybe to finally find some peace, Sandro used cocaine at a party during some holiday weekend and discovered it actually stopped his. Trembling gave him the relief nothing else could. I don't know how cocaine had that effect on him. Don't understand the chemistry or neurology behind it. In fact, I would have assumed it would make him more wired, more on edge. But surprisingly, it had the opposite effect, calming something in his nervous system that nothing else could reach. He said it focused his mind like a laser and the tremor disappeared, vanished like it had never been there. Having discovered what he thought was the miracle cure, the answer to his suffering, Sandro started using here and there, just occasionally at first. Only when things got heavy, he said. Only when he really needed it. Then he discovered it made him feel better. Zeroed out, as he put it. Like hitting a reset button, and much more capable of dealing with all the garbage of being a dismissed elite ex-cop with nothing to show for his years of service besides a severance check that barely covered rent. He started using more and more, a pattern so predictable it's almost tragic. A little before starting work, and a little after. Then during free time, then just whenever he wanted. the boundaries dissolving until there were no boundaries at all. But this obviously left Sandro with a serious problem, the same one that traps so many people. One day, he discovered he wanted to use more than he had money to afford, but he really didn't want to become that junkie who sells household items for drugs. Didn't want to see himself in that mirror. So instead, he went after a trafficker who knew how to refine the product, learned what was needed to transform the base paste into the drug, and then went about stealing or buying the chemicals on his shopping list, acquiring everything he needed piece by piece. He helped the trafficker with mixing, paid very close attention to every step of the process, and then started refining his own product just for personal use, keeping production small there in a little back room of the farm itself, hidden away where he thought no one would look. But just like when he started using, the amount he refined kept increasing until finally it became impossible to hide, until the operation grew beyond what one person could conceal. The narcotics police raided his shack, arrested Sandro, and he spent the next 12 years in a state penitentiary. Years that should have been spent rebuilding his life after service. He would have spent much more time behind bars if it were UNT for his service record in the military police, and his impeccable behavior as a prisoner, the way he followed every rule and helped other inmates. If it weren't for that, he would not have been released on parole after 9 years of the 18. The judge handed down in sentencing wouldn't have gotten this second chance. But I also suppose that before the judge, he showed a lot of enthusiasm for getting his life in order, painting a picture of redemption. Because that's certainly what he showed me the first time I saw him at that farm. Standing there with hope in his eyes, I thought it was going to be the easiest case I'd ever handled, a textbook example of successful rehabilitation. He was eager to reclaim his life to become more than his mistakes, and whenever I stopped by the farm or we met for coffee and a snack at a roadside diner, talking about his progress, his spirits seemed higher, his confidence growing. A few months passed like this, routine check-ins where everything seemed fine. Sandro was well on his way to obtaining all the signatures needed to reduce his sentence, including my recommendation, which I was genuinely happy to provide. I stopped by his farm for a scheduled visit only to discover he wasn't there, the place empty and quiet in a way that felt wrong. I found it strange, completely out of character for him to miss an appointment. And unlike other troublemakers I'd worked with over the years, guys who'd disappear at the first opportunity, I didn't assume he was trying to avoid me or skip out on justice because that wasn't who Sandro had shown himself to be. What happens when the person you believed in most, the one you were sure would make it, suddenly disappears? When trust meets absence, and you're left wondering if you misjudged everything. After having built up some trust between us, genuine connection beyond just officer and parolee, I tried calling his cell phone, hoping for a simple explanation. The first time it rang, each ring stretching out with possibility. But when it suddenly went to voicemail, I started getting a bad feeling. That instinct that comes from years of knowing when something's off. At best, he was running late, driving that old pickup truck back to the farm and didn't want to risk getting a ticket for talking on the cell while driving. A reasonable explanation I tried to convince myself was true. But then the next time I tried calling, it went straight to voicemail without even ringing, as if he'd turned off the device or pulled out the battery, as if he didn't want to be found. Sharing the comments something beginning with, "I have learned that, Because the lessons we gather from our hardest experiences, the wisdom earned through disappointment, and broken trust, becomes a gift when we share it with others who are walking similar paths. Your truth might be the compass someone else needs to navigate their own darkness, reminding them they were not alone in the complicated work of believing in people while protecting themselves from inevitable heartbreak, mine, maybe even a son." I met Sandro for the first time in an area of distant farms, almost in the rural zone, a place he called his temporary home after leaving the state penitentiary. That collection of properties was part of a resocialization project we were managing, somewhat improvised due to lack of funding, doing the best we could with limited resources. And all that extra freedom meant only the most promising rehabilitated inmates could stay there, the ones we believed had the best chance of making it on the outside. And of all those guys who ended up living in that brush for a while trying to rebuild their lives from scratch, I would have sworn Sandro was the most solid of them all, the one most likely to succeed. He was a former military police officer from Bobe, a real skull operator, with a heavy history of operations in the favelas. Before things really went sideways for him, but even being trained for war, for the kind of violence most people can't imagine, his head couldn't handle the constant pressure of confrontations in Rio. The relentless cycle of violence and death. I remember he used to say he left the force with a serious condition he called the tremors, a name that somehow captured what medications and diagnoses couldn't. I suppose officially what Sandro suffered from would be categorized as some form of post-traumatic stress disorder, the kind that comes from seeing too much, from doing things that haunt you. But for some reason, he never called it that. Never used the clinical terms. He just said he had tremors sometimes when his mind thought too much about the things he'd seen in the slums. Images that played on repeat, in the quiet moments. He tried every kind of medication. The strongest prescriptions they could give him. Every kind of therapy, from talk to exposure to everything in between. But nothing worked. Nothing could quiet the shaking that came from somewhere deeper than his muscles. Then one day, in an act of pure desperation to destroy himself once and for all, or maybe to finally find some peace, Sandro used cocaine at a party during some holiday weekend and discovered it actually stopped his. Trembling gave him the relief. Nothing else could. I don't know how cocaine had that effect on him. Don't understand the chemistry or neurology behind it. In fact, I would have assumed it would make him more wired, more on edge. But surprisingly, it had the opposite effect, calming something in his nervous system that nothing else could reach. He said it focused his mind like a laser and the tremor disappeared, vanished like it had never been there. Having discovered what he thought was the miracle cure, the answer to his suffering, Sandro started using here and there, just occasionally at first. Only when things got heavy, he said. Only when he really needed it. Then he discovered it made him feel better. Zeroed out, as he put it. Like hitting a reset button, and much more capable of dealing with all the garbage of being a dismissed elite ex-cop with nothing to show for his years of service besides a severance check that barely covered rent. He started using more and more, a pattern so predictable it's almost tragic. A little before starting work, and a little after, then during free time, then just whenever he wanted. The boundaries dissolving until there were no boundaries at all. But this obviously left Sandro with a serious problem. The same one that traps so many people. One day, he discovered he wanted to use more than he had money to afford, but he really didn't want to become that junkie who sells household items for drugs. Didn't want to see himself in that mirror. So instead, he went after a trafficker who knew how to refine the product, learned what was needed to transform the base paste into the drug, and then went about stealing or buying the chemicals on his shopping list, acquiring everything he needed piece by piece. He helped the trafficker with mixing, paid very close attention to every step of the process, and then started refining his own product, just for personal use. Keeping production small there in a little back room of the farm itself, hidden away where he thought no one would look. But just like when he started using, the amount he refined kept increasing until finally it became impossible to hide, until the operation grew beyond what one person could conceal. The narcotics police raided his shack, arrested Sandro, and he spent the next 12 years in a state penitentiary. Years that should have been spent rebuilding his life after service. He would have spent much more time behind bars if it were UNT for his service record in the military police and his impeccable behavior as a prisoner. The way he followed every rule and helped other inmates. If it weren't for that, he would have been released on parole after 9 years of the 80 the judge handed down in sentencing. Wouldn't have gotten this second chance. But I also suppose that before the judge, he showed a lot of enthusiasm for getting his life in order. Painting a picture of redemption. Because that's certainly what he showed me the first time I saw him at that farm. Standing there with hope in his eyes. I thought it was going to be the easiest case I'd ever handled. A textbook example of successful rehabilitation. He was eager to reclaim his life, to become more than his mistakes. And whenever I stopped by the farm or we met for coffee and a snack at a roadside diner talking about his progress, his spirits seemed higher, his confidence growing. A few months passed like this, routine check-ins where everything seemed fine. Sandro was well on his way to obtaining all the signatures needed to reduce his sentence, including my recommendation, which I was genuinely happy to provide. I stopped by his farm for a scheduled visit only to discover he wasn't there. The place empty and quiet in a way that felt wrong. I found it strange. Completely out of character for him to miss an appointment. And unlike other troublemakers I'd worked with over the years, guys who'd disappear at the first opportunity, I didn't assume he was trying to avoid me or skip out on justice because that wasn't who Sandro had shown himself to be. What happens when the person you believed in most, the one you were sure would make it, suddenly disappears? When trust meets absence, and you're left wondering if you misjudged everything. After having built up some trust between us, genuine connection beyond just officer and parolee, I tried calling his cell phone, hoping for a simple explanation. The first time it rang, each ring stretching out with possibility. But when it suddenly went to voicemail, I started getting a bad feeling. That instinct that comes from years of knowing when something's off. At best, he was running late, driving that old pickup truck back to the farm, and didn't want to risk getting a ticket for talking on the cell while driving. A reasonable explanation I tried to convince myself was true, but then the next time I tried calling, it went straight to voicemail, without even ringing, as if he'd turned off the device or pulled out the battery, as if he didn't want to be found. Share in the comments something beginning with, "I have learned that, ... Because the lessons we gather from our hardest experiences, the wisdom earned through disappointment and broken trust, becomes a gift when we share it with others who are walking similar paths. Your truth might be the compass. Someone else needs to navigate their own darkness, reminding them they're not alone in the complicated work of believing in people, while protecting themselves from inevitable heartbreak." I had carried the memory of that night like a stone pressed against my chest. A weight that never truly shifted, no matter how many vezes eu tentasse contar a mim mesmo. Outra versão dos fatos. Only one person died because of those bullets, and that person was Sandro. They identified him by the dental records from his old arrests, but the report said he was already gone before the fire reached him. No one could determine whether the shot that ended his life came from my gun or from the officers who arrived later. But deep down, I know. I think I killed the only person who truly needed my help. I've replayed that moment more times than I can count, wondering how different everything might have been if I had just listened to the quiet warnings inside me instead of the noise of duty and fear. Maybe Sandro would have survived the loss of his mother. Maybe he would have fallen again, wandered into shadows he couldn't handle. But the memory of her might have pulled him back. Sometimes I catch myself imagining what would have happened if I had reported his disappearance the moment I noticed something was wrong. If I had followed every step the way the manual demanded, perhaps the police would have found him long before I emptied my pistol toward that house. Maybe he would have gone to prison again, served his time, faced the consequences life kept throwing at him, but at least he would still be breathing. Instead, I am left carrying the truth that my good intentions carved a path straight to the worst ending possible. I wanted to save the boy, but I became part of what destroyed him. My name is Fernando, and what I'm about to recall happened in 2002. Back when I was 27 and working as a military police officer in a quiet countryside town where everything moved slowly. My life was simple then, marked by small routines and a peaceful rhythm I genuinely appreciated. My days were filled with minor calls, the same familiar patrols, and those precious breaks for coffee at the little diner across from the station where everyone knew my name. I had married young, already 5 years, with my wife Juliana, and father to Gabriel and Lara, the two lights guiding every step I took. For a long time, our town felt like a safe corner of the world, a place where worries rarely grew into anything serious. Then, without warning, the calm began to unravel. It started with a call from Donacida, a woman who lived alone in a modest house on the outskirts. Her son Rafael, a construction helper, hadn't returned home for 2 days, and she was drowning in fear. He was known for drinking a bit too much, but he always came back, even drunk. I promised her I'd find him, and I meant it. I searched everywhere. He usually went to the bar, the construction site, the boarding house he used when he stayed out too late. No one had seen him. His co-workers mentioned he'd been acting strangely, glancing over his shoulder like someone being watched. I assumed it was just alcohol-fed paranoia, but the comments lingered in my mind. Days passed and nothing surfaced. A full week went by, and Donacida's worry was turning into despair. Disappearances simply didn't happen in our town, not like these. While I was still trying to piece together Rafael's trail, Marcos, my partner, called me sounding more serious than I'd ever heard him. He told me to meet him at the abandoned Mora farm. The place had been empty for years, a hangout for kids looking for trouble. The night was dark, the sky heavy with the threat of rain as I pulled up, headlights cutting through the emptiness. Marcos was waiting, leaning against the patrol car. He didn't explain, just led me inside. The smell hid first mold, mixed with something sharp and metallic that made my stomach twist. When he pointed the flashlight at the wooden floor, I felt my heartbeat stumble. A dark, fresh stain spread across the boards. I whispered a prayer without realizing it. The blood was recent, no more than a day old. That discovery sent everything into motion. and soon the place was crawling with investigators searching for clues that refused to appear. Everything in me tightened with a sense of inevitability that I couldn't name. It looked as though someone had cleaned the entire place with meticulous care, yet for some reason had left that dark stain behind, almost as if it were a message meant for us. Days passed, and more people began to disappear. First, it was Beatriz, the waitress from the diner where I stopped for coffee every morning. And then old Mr. Antonio, who lived alone just a few blocks from the center of town. Each disappearance was stranger than the last. No signs of struggle, no witnesses, nothing that made sense. Fear began to settle over the city like a thick fog, and Juliana was terrified. I tried to calm her, but inside I was just as scared. Especially for the children. Our house sat near the edge of the woods, a little isolated, and somehow that made the darkness feel even closer. One night, while I was on patrol, the wind picked up and the sky turned heavy with storm. Then the radio buzzed. It was Juliana calling the station, begging to speak to me. Her voice was trembling as she said there was someone outside, a shadow moving near the shed. I told her to lock herself in the bedroom with the kids, hit the siren, and sped home with a dread I couldn't shake. When I arrived, the children were clinging to her, pale wheat fear. I grabbed my flashlight and my gun and headed toward the shed as the wind twisted the trees into shapes that looked alive. Just as I reached the door, I heard something dragging across the floor. I kicked it open and swept the light inside. A gaunt figure cowered in the corner, filthy, trembling, eyes wide with a terror that felt contagious. He was all skin and bone, dressed in shredded clothes stained with dried blood. I lowered the gun, barely recognizing him as I whispered his name. It was Raphael. Before he fainted, he asked if he was coming. I carried him out, called for rescue, and rode with him to the municipal hospital, praying he'd survive long enough to speak. When he finally woke, the story he told made the air in the room feel colder. He said a man he called the Collector had taken him, kept him in a hidden pit deep in the woods, feeding him just enough to keep him alive until the moment he decided to purify him. His testimony triggered a full task force. For days we searched the dense woods, guided only by his memories and the hope that someone else might still be alive. Then the forensic team found blood traces and drag marks near the abandoned quarry. When we compared that with Raphael's description of the underground pit, everything aligned. But fear continued to grow in the city, as if the shadows themselves were listening. One night, trying to rest at home with Juliana and the kids, the storm returned and the power went out. The house fell into total darkness. I lit candles, grabbed my lantern, and then the phone rang. Marco's voice was frantic as he told me to get to the station immediately. They had found the place. I told Juliana to lock all the doors and not let anyone in, then raced out into the storm. We drove through the mud and thick brush until we reached a hidden clearing. There, concealed beneath leaves and branches, we discovered a concrete hatch. It was the entrance. Even knowing what we might find didn't prepare me for the horror below. When we descended into that pit, we found Raphael, Bia, and Mr. Antonio still alive, barely, their bodies fragile from starvation and fear. Around them were the remains of others who hadn't survived, in stages of decomposition that made the air almost impossible to breathe. The ground was littered with rotten food and filth, but the worst were the bodies scattered across the dirt floor. He was inside that pit when we arrived, checking the victims with a calm so unnatural it made my blood boil. A middle-aged man with a blank expression, as if nothing around him carried weight. Only later did we learn he'd lived in the region for years. Always quiet, always unnoticed. He didn't resist, didn't speak, didn't plead. He simply allowed the handcuffs to close around his wrists and offered a thin, icy smile as we pushed him into the back seat of the patrol car. As though everything unfolding matched exactly what he expected. The weeks that followed felt like a storm without end. Reporters came from everywhere, turning our small town into a headline no one wanted to read. Those who survived slowly began to recover, their bodies fragile, but they were stubborn enough to fight. As for the ones who didn't make it, the remains had to be removed with care, handled gently, despite the horror of their condition. We met with the families, and because of the advanced decomposition, immediate burial with sealed coffins was the only option. It was heartbreaking, but it was the last dignity we could offer. Our town was never the same after that chapter. Raphael and the others took months to heal, inside and out, each carrying a silence deeper than words could reach. In the end, the man whose name I refused to speak was sentenced to the maximum penalty, locked away where he would never harm anyone again. Juliana and the kids sleep peacefully now, knowing he can't touch our lives anymore. But the scars remain in all of Isa. Reminder that evil can grow quietly, close enough to breathe the same air. All of this happened in 2008, when I was still working radio patrol in our quiet mountain town. Before I tell you the next nightmare, you need to understand something. I've always been just a regular guy. I love a good, loaded hot dog, a cold beer at the end of the day. And I've been a Corinthians fan since I was a kid. I grew up by the old state school near the battalion and always thought I'd become a carpenter like my father. Becoming a cop wasn't part of the plan, but life has its own way of choosing for us. I like keeping my routine steady, though I won't deny that a little adrenaline now and then feels like fuel. That day started like any other. I was driving the patrol car along the cobblestone streets, enjoying the calm and the crisp scent of eucalyptus drifting down from the mountains. Our town is the type where everyone knows everyone, and the worst crimes tend to be bar fights after a big game or kids tagging a wall. Around noon, the dispatcher sent out a missing person call rare for us. Usually it's just a teenager cooling off at a friend's house or someone too drunk to catch the right bus home. But this case was different. The caller was Donna Helena, a well-known woman who visited the bakery every morning. She was frantic, saying her husband, Roberto, hadn't come home since the previous night. He was a retired firefighter, strong, respected, in his 60s. And he loved hiking the dense forest behind their property. He'd left for a walk and never returned. I tried to calm her and promised we'd do everything we could. When I arrived, she was trembling on the porch, rubbing her hands together as though trying to wake herself from a bad dream. She said Roberto hadn't acted strangely, hadn't said anything unusual. He just loved those trails that led toward the river. That was enough to tell me where the search needed to begin. The forest there was thick, the kind that swallowed sunlight and sound. If you didn't know the paths, you could vanish without meaning to. I entered calling his name, thinking he might have slipped or gotten hurt. But the deeper I walked, the heavier something pressed on my chest. The forest was too quiet, no birds, no insects, just an unnatural stillness that made the air feel wrong. After hours without finding anything, I called for backup. My partner, Mark Howe, arrived with 2 officers. He was a big guy with a good heart, always joking to keep the tension from crushing us. His presence alone felt like a shield. We spread out, combing the woods, but there was no trace of Roberto, not even a broken branch or a footprint. It was as if a D vanished into the earth itself. I went home, but sleep never came. My mind kept circling the same questions, the same shadows, as if the night itself refused to let me rest. At sunrise, we were back in the woods, determined to find something, anything. Even the tracking dogs caught Roberto's scent near the main trail before losing it by the river, where we found his hat and a flashlight abandoned in the mud. He knew that forest better than anyone, and nothing there suggested a fight or an accident. Days passed, and the whole town felt suspended in fear, whispering theories that dissolved every time we looked at the cold, empty facts. I couldn't let it go. Even on my days off, I disappeared into the trees with a flashlight and a stubborn hope that refused to die. Almost 2 weeks later, as the sun was bleeding out behind the hills, I stumbled upon a clearing I had never seen before, and an old shack collapsing under its own weight. I had patrolled that area for years, yet it felt like the forest had hidden that place until it wanted me to find it. Inside, the air was thick with rot, and the walls were lined with relics of another time-rusted cans. A straw mattress. Newspapers from decades ago filled with headlines about people who vanished, just like Roberto. A chill crawled up my spine as I realized the pattern was older and darker than we imagined. He took photos, showed them at the station, but no one believed the place meant anything. Still, something inside me insisted there was more, and I returned alone one silent night. The forest felt like it was holding its breath. That was when I found the trapdoor hidden beneath a filthy rug, and the cold air rising from it felt like stepping into another world. The tunnel beneath led to a dirt chamber covered in clippings and photographs of missing people among them. Robert, and there he was, tied to a chair, alive, but barely holding on. Saving him felt like pulling someone out of a nightmare made real. As we tried to escape, the man responsible appeared in the doorway, eyes wild, voice dripping with madness. What followed was instinct, fear, and the desperate need to protect a life I had just pulled back from the edge. We got out, and Roberto survived, but the truth that surfaced afterwards stained the entire city with horror. The man had taken others before him, had done unspeakable things, and had walked among us unnoticed for 20 years. Has considerado como a escuridão de único coração pode permanecer escondida por tanto tempo? Even now, with Roberto safe and the case closed, something inside me remains unsettled, as if the forest whispered a warning I still don't fully understand. The weight of what I saw changed the way I look at every shadow, every silence, every lonely road we patrol. That place taught me how terrifying the unseen can be, and how deeply the human soul can scar when it carries secrets it never asked to witness.